I'm Rosalie Hartford. And the night my sister's promotion gala turned into a silent disaster started with her laughing to a circle of partners that I was the bakery girl filling in because real staff were booked. A line she tossed out just as my phone lit, with the message confirming Horizon Ledger's acquisition of Brixton and more. I kept moving through the ballroom while Clarissa glanced at me over her shoulder like I'd wandered in from another life. And the only thing breaking the noise in my head was the quiet reminder that Martin Caldwell expected to meet me before the evening was over. I didn't correct anyone. Not even when one guest murmured that I carried myself well for someone helping with trays, because the truth already sat in my pocket, waiting for its moment to breathe. Clarissa pulled me aside near the service corridor to remind me that the champagne had to circulate evenly and that I shouldn't hover too close to the executives. And I answered that everything was under control while she studied my clothes like they proved her point. My mother drifted over long enough to say the gala was important for Clarissa's future, and I should help things run smoothly. Her voice warm but trimmed with the same assumption that I didn't belong among the guests. None of them noticed the unread email pinned at the top of my screen. The one where Martin wrote that he looked forward to meeting the woman who'd just reshaped his firm's ownership. I stepped back into the ballroom carrying the last tray Clarissa wanted out before the program began, and she whispered that I should stay near the doors so her team wouldn't feel pressured to acknowledge me. A partner walked past and joked that Clarissa was lucky to have family willing to pitch in, and she smiled like the remark confirmed a story she'd authored long ago. I held her gaze for a moment, not to challenge her, but because the evening she believed she controlled had already shifted, and the quiet part of me she dismissed was the only thing in the room holding the truth. Clarissa cornered me in the bakery that morning while the mixers were still humming, and her eyes moved over my apron before she reminded me that tonight matters to people who've actually built a career, and I should avoid doing anything that made guests think I was part of the program. My mother wiped her hands on a towel and mentioned that Clarissa had been under pressure for weeks, and I needed to be supportive the way family should, letting the words hang between us like a gentle warning. I nodded and stacked pastry boxes as Clarissa glanced at the chalkboard menu and murmured that the place had a sweet charm but no scale. A line meant to land quietly but not softly. I drove home with her voice still pressed against my thoughts, and when my phone buzzed with the notification confirming that Horizon Ledger's purchase agreement had officially cleared internal review, the timing felt almost surgical. Ryan called while I was changing for the event, and when I mentioned the acquisition, he paused long enough for me to hear his uncertainty before he asked if this kind of deal could drag your family into legal tension. Choosing caution over confidence in a way that tightened something in my chest. I told him the transition would follow standard Maryland procedures, and nothing involved my parents. Yet the hesitation in his breathing circled back to every holiday dinner where he watched them belittle my work without stepping in. By late afternoon, Clarissa sent a stream of texts about delivery timing and repeated that the hors d'oeuvres had to look elevated so no one thinks they came from a family shop. And I typed back confirmations while she added that I should dress neutral so the catering team knows who to coordinate with. My mother checked in minutes later to remind me that Clarissa's partners were accustomed to a certain polish, and it would help if I stayed out of group photos so no one got confused about roles. I stared at the phone resting on my counter, the acquisition email glowing beneath their messages, and the steady beat of their assumptions pressed against me like a rhythm they'd rehearsed for years without noticing who I'd become. The call came just as I was reviewing the final compliance packet, and Martin's voice carried the unhurried certainty of someone who already understood the weight of the evening when he asked if I was prepared for the moment Horizon, Ledger, and Brixton, and more finally shake hands in person. I told him the paperwork had cleared internal counsel in Annapolis, and the transfer was set to activate before the gala program ended. And he responded that he would find me quietly rather than disrupt whatever story my family believed they were living tonight. When the line clicked off, the room settled around me with the reminder that the signature Clarissa chased for years had already been rerouted to the sister she kept out of every photograph. Ryan called minutes later while I was setting out what I planned to wear, and the softness in his voice tightened when he heard Martin's name woven into my plans for the evening. He asked if I was sure this kind of acquisition won't pull you into unnecessary conflict. and the question carried the same careful distance he used whenever my parents dismissed my work as a hobby. A distance that felt louder now that the deal involved the firm Clarissa treated like her inheritance. I explained that the transition followed Maryland's standard regulatory steps, and nothing about it touched my family. Yet the quiet on his end settled, like a verdict he didn't know he'd spoken. I hung up and looked at the invitation Clarissa had mailed weeks earlier, its embossed edges promising a future she guarded fiercely. And the contrast between her certainty and the documents on my desk felt almost engineered. Martin's meeting request glowed at the top of my inbox beneath the acquisition confirmation, both waiting for the ballroom doors to open. By the time I zipped my dress, the evening had already chosen its direction, and all that remained was letting it unfold without correcting a single assumption they'd made about who I was. The ballroom looked exactly like the world Clarissa curated for herself, and she glided toward a group of partners with a quick glance in my direction before telling them her team was thrilled to have extra hands from the family shop to keep things running smoothly. One of the women smiled at her and asked if it ever felt strange to mix business with relatives, and Clarissa answered that it worked fine, as long as everyone understands their lane. Letting her eyes skim over me, as if to underline the point, I carried the first tray past them without hesitation, feeling the space tighten around the assumption she'd chosen for me. She intercepted me near the registration table and adjusted the angle of the glasses, noting that presentation matters when people have standards. And she followed it with a soft reminder that I should avoid lingering near the center floor where photos would be taken. My father approached help enough to mention that Clarissa hoped tonight would lead to a new client portfolio and that I shouldn't accidentally distract from the momentum she's built, giving me a supportive smile that didn't match the message. I told him the guests looked well taken care of, and Clarissa brushed past us with a quick whisper that if a tray ran low, it reflects on whoever's holding it. As the quartet shifted songs, Clarissa introduced me to a pair of junior associates as our resident logistics expert from Hartford Pastry Room, and one of them laughed that it must be sweet to help your sister shine like this. My mother joined the circle and added that I'd always been good with my hands, and that it was kind of me to give my evening to support something so important, wrapping her arm around Clarissa with the pride reserved for the child she understood. I excused myself with the next rotation, and Clarissa murmured that I should double-check the kitchen because consistency is everything in an event that can change a career. When I returned with another set of flutes, a partner leaned toward Clarissa and complimented her leadership for keeping every piece aligned, even the family element, and Clarissa answered that she believed in using every resource wisely while gesturing subtly toward me. Another guest asked if I ever considered working full-time in hospitality, and Clarissa jumped in with a laugh that I'd found my comfort zone years ago, leaving no space for me to speak. I set the tray on the passing station, and the contrast between their certainty and the documents waiting in my inbox left a quiet current running beneath the noise. Martin entered the ballroom just as Clarissa gathered a cluster of partners around her, and she touched his arm with a bright smile while telling them she was honored to have him witness a milestone for our division, before gesturing toward me with the quiet confidence of someone placing pieces exactly where she wanted them. He looked past her and greeted me with a steady Ms. Hartford. I wondered how long it would take for us to cross paths tonight, and the partners glanced between us as Clarissa laughed too quickly and asked how he knew our family helper. He studied her for a beat before answering that he was surprised she hadn't mentioned me, considering that Horizon Ledger's new controlling stake meant your sister now holds more influence in Brixton and more than any of us expected. Clarissa's smile thinned as someone asked if he meant a consulting partnership, and she stepped closer while insisting there must be confusion because I spent my time supporting a bakery that barely breaks even. Martin lifted his glass and explained that the acquisition finalized earlier in the evening granted Horizon Ledger majority ownership, and that Ms. Hartford negotiated every term with the precision of someone who understands both risk and return. My mother whispered that he must be mistaken because I'd never been interested in finance, and Martin turned toward her with a courteous nod as he added that the documents filed in Annapolis made the matter public the moment the signatures cleared. My father asked why no one from our family had been informed if such a significant shift was happening, and Clarissa cut in before he finished, insisting that Martin must have misread the filing because my sister wouldn't even know where to begin with an acquisition of this scale. I met her stare and told her Horizon Ledger had handled similar transitions for years, and that she'd walked past the platform's reports every day at the office without realizing the analytics came from my team. One of the partners murmured that the white label systems had been essential to their forecasting, and Clarissa blinked twice before repeating that none of this made sense. She demanded to know why I hadn't been upfront if I possessed something this consequential, and I answered that she'd never asked about my work unless it served the story she wanted the room to believe. My mother stepped in with a trembling question about whether this meant Clarissa's promotion would be delayed, and Martin replied that restructuring often affected internal trajectories, though he expected collaboration to be smoother now that ownership and operations were finally aligned. Clarissa's voice cracked as she told me I'd humiliated her on the biggest night of her career, and I held her gaze while explaining that I hadn't changed anything in the room except the part where she assumed I had nothing to bring to it. A hush spread through the circle when another partner asked if this made me their new reporting authority, and Martin answered that transition memos would go out Monday, confirming departmental shifts. Clarissa whispered that this couldn't be happening because she'd worked too hard to build her name, and I reminded her that I'd built mine quietly while she made sure no one believed I had one. The quartet resumed playing as the partners drifted back toward the main floor, but the air between us stayed suspended, carrying the weight of a truth that had finally stopped waiting to be recognized. Ryan found me in the side corridor, where the noise of the ballroom softened, and he asked how long I'd planned to let him stand next to me without knowing you were taking ownership of the firm my girlfriend practically lives inside. I told him the details had been in motion for months, and nothing about the acquisition touched my family until tonight. But he shook his head and said the part that scared him was realizing I could move in worlds I never mentioned while expecting everyone to just keep up. His voice carried the same careful distance he used whenever my parents dismissed my work. And for the first time, I heard how much room he'd left for their voices instead of mine. He stepped closer and asked why I hadn't trusted him enough to be part of the truth. And I reminded him of every dinner where Clarissa joked about my apron strings while he stayed quiet because stirring the pot never helped anyone. He insisted he'd only wanted to keep the peace, and that none of this meant he thought less of me. But the words slid under the weight of all the nights he'd watched them corner me and chosen silence as his contribution. I told him I'd stopped expecting him to understand my work the moment he warned me the acquisition might cause trouble for people who've earned their place. A sentence that told me exactly where he believed I stood. He reached for my hand and asked if this was really the moment I wanted to redefine us. And I answered that the moment had been building every time he let their assumptions go unchecked, while telling me love didn't need confrontation. He tried to reassure me that he could change, but I reminded him that respect isn't a promise squeezed out under pressure. It's the one thing that has to show up before anyone asks for it. When I walked back toward the ballroom, his voice followed with a soft, "Don't do this." And I kept moving because the version of me he wanted was the one who made herself smaller so the room could stay comfortable. Clarissa caught up to me near the edge of the ballroom with her voice shaking as she demanded to know if I understood what you've done to my career tonight. And she insisted that she'd rather resign than work in a firm where I held authority over anything connected to her name. I told her resignation was her choice, but not her escape, because Brixton and Moore would be restructuring on Monday, and her new placement would be in the community finance division, where she'd support small Maryland businesses learning to stabilize their books. She stared at me as if I'd rewritten the ground under her feet, and the only sound between us was the distant clinking of glasses while the partners pretended not to look. My mother approached with the strained calm she used whenever the bakery hit a crisis, and asked whether this reassignment could be handled more delicately. I'm reminding us that Clarissa had worked too hard to be sent backward. I told her the position wasn't backward at all, and that the division needed someone willing to learn fundamentals instead of performing polish, a role that mattered more than the titles my sister chased. My mother whispered that she never imagined she'd have to report to me through any chain of responsibility. And I answered that neither did I until tonight made it clear how little space there'd ever been for what I built. My father stepped forward with a stiffness that carried every family dinner we'd endured. And he admitted that he'd let too much slide because your mother and sister seemed to know the world better than I did. He looked at Clarissa and told her the way she'd spoken about me all evening was unacceptable, now that the truth was no longer something she could sidestep. And she demanded to know why he was suddenly taking my side when he'd never questioned her ambition before. He turned back to me and said he'd failed to protect what he didn't understand. And this was the first time he'd realized how deeply that failure had cut. Clarissa muttered that none of this would hold once she explained the misunderstanding to HR. And I reminded her that ownership memos outrank internal narratives and the transition documents were already timestamped. My mother's face fell as the reality set in, and she asked whether the bakery would remain untouched by any of this. And I assured her it would, because the only thing I needed from Monday onward was clarity, not control. When they stepped back into the ballroom, the murmur around us shifted, and the night that began with certainty had narrowed into a corridor where every consequence finally met its owner. The bakery lights were low when I walked in through the back door, and my mother looked up from the counter with a quiet, "You're home earlier than I thought," before asking if the gala had ended the way I expected. I told her the night simply revealed what had been waiting in plain sight, and she untied her heels while admitting she hadn't realized how wide the gap had grown between what she believed and what I'd built. My father carried out a tray of cooling pastries and asked if there was anything left to fix after the chaos upstairs. And I answered that nothing needed fixing. Only facing. My mother placed a plate in front of me and whispered that she'd never meant to make me feel small, and that tonight forced her to understand how easily love can hide behind assumptions when no one stops to check the truth. I reminded her that I'd never wanted her to choose between us, and she pressed her hand to the counter while asking if Clarissa would manage the new role or if the shift would break her. I told her the role wouldn't break anyone willing to learn, and my father exhaled with a softness that settled between us like a long overdue admission. He looked at the empty storefront and murmured that the bakery had taught all of us what beginnings look like, and that I'd carried more of it with me than he ever noticed while letting noise from the outside world drown out the quiet parts. My mother asked if I intended to keep coming back after everything that happened, and I told her the bakery wasn't something I returned to for obligation, but for grounding. The way some people return to a familiar song. She nodded once with a tired smile, and as we wiped down the last of the counters, the night felt less like an ending than a circle finally closing where it began. Thank you for staying with me through every turn of this night, and the quiet truth it finally allowed to surface. If any part of my story echoed something in your own life, I hope it brought you a little steadiness and a little light. If you'd like to hear more, you're welcome to stay.